Good evening. Tonight, we return to the quiet corners of campus life where laughter echoes down long hallways, and midnight whispers drift through paper-thin walls. Dorm rooms are supposed to be safe, a small world of books, dreams, and new beginnings. But sometimes, a dorm room can hold something else. Something that lingers long after the lights go out. So, as you lie back and let your mind slow down, listen closely to these true dorm room ghost stories. Each one drawn from the places students called home and never quite forgot. Our first story takes us to Hollow Creek Hall. An aging dorm on the edge of campus, quiet and unassuming. Until one student realized they weren't the only one who lived there. This is The Room at Hollow Creek Hall. Story 1, The Room at Hollow Creek Hall. I don't usually talk about what happened during my first semester at Hollow Creek University. It's not that I've forgotten, if anything, I remember every single detail too vividly. But for a long time, I tried to convince myself that it was just stress. Sleep paralysis. Overactive imagination. That's what everyone says when something strange happens in a dorm room, right? That's what I told myself too until the night I heard someone whisper my name from inside the wall. This is one of those true dorm room ghost stories that doesn't start with a scream or a shadow. It started with silence. Arrival. When I first moved into Hollow Creek Hall, it was early September. The air was crisp, the trees already beginning to turn. The building was old, built sometime in the late 1940s, they said, and the moment I stepped inside, I felt it. The air was heavier than outside. Not bad, just still. Like the air in a church that hasn't been opened for a while. I was assigned to room 313. A single on the third floor. It was small, one bed, one desk, one window that overlooked the back courtyard. The kind of room that felt too quiet, even when you had music playing. When my parents helped me unpack, my mom commented on the smell. It wasn't mold or dust, more like old paper and metal. The smell of something aged and untouched. I told her it was probably from the vents, since the building was ancient. We joked about it and left it at that. The first week. For the first few nights, I didn't notice anything. I was too busy adjusting to college life, late night study sessions, new faces, cafeteria food. But around the fourth night, I started waking up around 3 a.m. for no reason. It wasn't a noise that woke me up. It was the silence. A deep, heavy quiet that felt wrong, like the world outside my dorm had frozen. No cars, no footsteps, not even the distant hum of the building's pipes. At first, I'd roll over and force myself back to sleep. But as the nights went on, I began to hear something faint, like a slow tapping from behind the wall near my desk. Not constant. Just a few soft knocks. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't rhythmic, or mechanical. It sounded hesitant. Almost curious. The tapping. By the second week, the tapping had become a nightly thing. Always between 3 o'clock and 3:15 a.m. I started keeping my phone nearby, trying to record it, but of course, nothing ever picked up. The walls in Hollow Creek Hall were thick plaster and brick, so it couldn't have been a neighbor. And the room next to mine, 315, was empty that semester. The door stayed locked, and I'd never seen anyone go in or out. One night, I decided to knock back. It sounds stupid now, but in that half-asleep, half-brave state, I thought maybe I could figure out what it was. When the tapping started 3 slow knocks, I sat up in bed and waited. Then I tapped back. 3 times. Silence. I felt a strange sense of embarrassment, like I was talking to myself. But just as I started to lie down again, the tapping came again. This time, closer to where my head was resting, like it had moved along the wall. That's when I stopped breathing for a moment. The sound wasn't coming from inside the wall. It was coming through it like someone's knuckles brushing the other side. Soft. Deliberate. I whispered, "Hello." The tapping stopped. Room 315. A few days later, I asked the floor's resident advisor about room 315. She looked surprised and said, "Oh, that room? It's been closed for maintenance since last year. They said there was water damage or something." Water damage? That made sense. Maybe the pipes were making noise. Except the tapping didn't sound like water. It sounded like fingers. When I asked if anyone had ever stayed there, she hesitated. Then she said quietly, "Yeah, there was a student in that room about 5 years ago. She, had an accident." I asked what kind of accident. The RA just shrugged, uncomfortable. "They don't really talk about it. But yeah, it's been empty since then." That night, I didn't sleep much. The whisper. By mid-October, I had learned to live with the tapping. It wasn't constant. Some nights, it didn't happen at all. But when it did, I'd just pull the blanket over my head and try to ignore it. Then came the whisper. It happened on a Sunday night. I had been studying late, and around 2:45 a.m., I finally decided to call it a night. As I switched off my lamp, I heard a voice so faint I thought I imagined it. It sounded like a girl, whispering my name. Not from inside the room, but from behind the wall. It was a drawn-out, breathy sound. "Elise. That's my name, Eli. No one on that floor knew me well enough to play a prank, and besides, it wasn't laughter or teasing. It was sorrowful. Soft. Like someone was calling out for help." I froze. I didn't move or answer. I just listened. And after a few seconds, I heard a faint sob, one quiet exhale, like someone crying very softly. Then silence. That was the first night I slept with the light on. The smell. A week later, the smell changed. It wasn't the old paper scent anymore. It was sweeter, almost like flowers, lilacs, maybe. But underneath, there was something metallic. I noticed it most when I was near the wall between my room and 315. The air was warmer there, too, as if something was faintly radiating from inside the wall. I told myself I'd talk to maintenance about it, but part of me didn't want to draw attention. I didn't want them to move me out of the room. I don't know why, maybe because I felt like if I left, she'd follow. The photograph. One afternoon, I was in the student lounge downstairs, and there was a bulletin board with old photos of the dorms through the years. I found one of Hollow Creek Hall from the 1980s, a black and white picture of students standing in the courtyard. And near the bottom, someone had written names in pen. I scanned the list and stopped at one. Sarah L. Room 315. I don't know what made me look up just then, but in the corner of the photo, in one of the windows on the third floor, there was a faint outline. A girl, standing near the glass, her face pale and slightly blurred. Room 315. The photo was old, but something about her eyes even in the grainy image made my chest tighten. She looked sad and lonely. I remember tracing her outline with my finger and whispering her name to myself, Sarah. When I went back to my room that night, the tapping started earlier than usual. The door. By November, the nights grew colder. The wind outside whistled through the cracks of the window frame, and every sound in the dorm felt sharper. The whispers had stopped for a while, but the tapping remained. And sometimes, I could swear I heard faint footsteps in the hallway when no one was there. Then, one night, I woke up to a soft click. The sound of a door latch. I turned my head, half asleep, and saw that my door, which I always locked, was open about an inch. The hall beyond it was dark. The air inside my room felt colder than ever before. I reached for my phone to use its flashlight, but before I could turn it on, I heard breathing. Not mine. Not from the hallway. From inside the room. Slow. Uneven. Like someone was standing near the foot of my bed. I froze completely, afraid to even blink. Then, from the direction of the desk, came a faint scraping sound, metal against wood, like my chair being moved slightly. And then, a whisper. Eli. I felt the air shift beside me, a subtle movement as if someone had brushed past my blanket. When I turned on the flashlight, there was nothing there. But my chair had been turned to face the wall. The discovery. The next day, I couldn't focus on anything. Between classes, I went straight to the library and started digging through old campus archives. It took me a while, but I found an old article from 2018. A sophomore named Sarah Linton, who lived in room 315, was found unresponsive in her dorm one winter morning. The cause of death was listed as undetermined. She had been struggling with depression, the article said. There was a note, but it was never made public. I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen. It wasn't a horror story. It was just a sad one. But it made everything in my room make sense: the tapping, the whispers, the scent of flowers. She wasn't trying to scare me. She was trying to be heard. The last night. Finals week came fast, and everyone was too tired to care about anything but studying. I had gotten used to the strange presence in my room. Sometimes I'd even speak out loud, softly, when I felt that heaviness in the air. I'd say, "It's okay, Sarah. I know you're here." But on my last night before winter break, something changed. It was snowing hard outside. The whole campus was quiet, blanketed in white. I packed my bags and sat on the edge of the bed, just taking it all in: the soft hum of the heater, the glow of the streetlights through the frost. Then the smell came back. Lilacs, strong and sweet. And I felt it again, that warmth near the wall. I stood up and walked toward it, placing my hand against the cold plaster. It was faintly vibrating. And then I heard her. Not a whisper this time, but a voice, right behind my ear. "Thank you." The air seemed to lighten instantly, like the weight that had been pressing on me for months was suddenly gone. The tapping never came again. Epilogue. When I came back for spring semester, room 313 had been reassigned. They'd moved me to a different dorm, citing renovations. I didn't argue. A few weeks later, I walked past Hollow Creek Hall and saw that the door to room 315 was finally open. Maintenance workers were inside, repainting the walls and tearing out the old flooring. For just a moment, as I glanced in through the doorway, I saw something that made me stop. The faint reflection of a girl in the window, her head tilted slightly, eyes calm. Then the workers moved, and the reflection was gone. Even now, when I hear stories about haunted dorms or strange things happening in college buildings, I can't help but think of her. Most people laugh, say it's just another one of those true dorm room ghost stories. But I know what I heard. What I felt. And sometimes, when I smell lilacs in the middle of winter, I still whisper her name. The next story comes from a student who thought their biggest challenge would be studying for exams. Until the shadows in their room began to move. Every night, right by the window. This is room 209, the shadow by the window. Story 2, room 209, the shadow by the window. I've lived in a lot of places since college, but none of them have stayed with me quite like room 209 at Ashmore Hall. It wasn't the biggest dorm, or the newest, or even the creepiest looking from the outside. In daylight, it looked ordinary: rows of red brick, white window frames, the smell of cut grass in spring. But at night, when the hallways went quiet and the radiators started their low metallic groans, the building seemed to breathe. And somewhere inside that old heartbeat, something watched me. Even now, I can't tell you exactly what it was, only that it didn't want me there. And this, unfortunately, is one of those true dorm room ghost stories that isn't about imagination, it's about endurance. Move-in day. I transferred to Ashmore University halfway through my sophomore year. Everything about that semester felt rushed: new classes, new campus, new people. Housing was full, so I was placed in the only room available, 209, second floor of the oldest dorm on campus. When the RA handed me the key, he said with a half smile, "You're lucky. That room's been empty for a while. It's one of the quiet ones." Quiet sounded perfect to me. I'd always preferred silence over chaos. But I didn't realize what kind of silence he meant. When I stepped inside for the first time, a cold draft brushed past me, even though the window was closed. The air smelled faintly of burnt dust, like an old heater that hadn't run in years. The walls were bare except for one thing: an old corkboard above the desk, stained in the middle with a dark circular mark. I ran my hand over it absent-mindedly. It felt cold. Not just cool to the touch, cold, like metal in winter. I shrugged it off, unpacked, and went to dinner. When I came back that evening, the mark on the corkboard was gone. The first night. That night, I lay in bed listening to the hum of the radiator. The building made normal sounds: pipes clicking, floorboards expanding. I was almost asleep when I heard the first sound that didn't fit. It was a whisper, low, muffled, and close to the wall behind my bed. I thought maybe someone in the next room was on a phone call, but when I listened closely, the whisper was different. It wasn't speech. It was breathing. Slow, shaky breaths that sounded like someone trying not to be heard. I turned over and pressed my ear against the wall. The breathing stopped immediately. I stared into the dark for a long time, the silence heavy enough to make my chest ache. Eventually, I fell asleep. But just before I did, I heard the soft creak of the floorboards as if someone was standing near the window. The window. The window in room 209 was large, with old wooden frames painted over a dozen times. It looked out onto the courtyard, a small square of grass surrounded by the four wings of Ashmore Hall. At night, the lights from the opposite windows glowed faintly, casting pale reflections across the glass. About a week after moving in, I noticed something strange. When I'd come back from late classes, I could see my reflection in the window, but sometimes, there was a delay. I'd move my head and for just a split second, my reflection would stay still before catching up. Like an echo in a mirror. I thought it was exhaustion or bad lighting. Until one night, I saw something else. I was sitting at my desk, headphones on, reading notes, when I noticed movement in the reflection. Behind me a dark shape. Tall, still, standing near the door. I froze. I didn't turn around right away. Instead, I slowly slid off my headphones and listened. Nothing. No footsteps. No breathing. When I finally turned, the room was empty. But the door, which I always left latched, was open a few inches. The history. The next day, I asked my roommate from down the hall if he knew anything about room 209. He laughed at first, saying, "What, did you see the Ashmore ghost already?" When I pressed him, his face changed slightly. He said, "You should ask campus security. They don't really like to talk about it, though." So I did. At the security desk, an older guard looked up my room number and frowned. He hesitated, then said, "There was an incident there about 10 years ago. A student named Daniel, quiet guy, didn't go out much, passed away in that room. They said it was an accident, but," he trailed off. "But what?" I asked. The guard shrugged. "People said he was acting strange before it happened. Talking about someone standing by the window at night." I felt my stomach drop. When I got back to my room, the window was open. I never opened that window. The nightly pattern. From that night on, the noises became regular. It started with faint knocks, 2 short taps from somewhere near the corkboard. Then came the breathing. Then the footsteps. Always between 2:45 and 3:15 a.m. Always stopping the moment I moved. At first, I tried to ignore it. I'd put on white noise, leave the desk lamp on, even stay in the lounge until I was too tired to care. But the thing about exhaustion is it doesn't stop fear. It just blurs it. I started dreaming of the room even when I wasn't there. In those dreams, I was lying in bed, staring at the window, and someone was standing outside, their hand pressed to the glass, watching me sleep. I'd wake up covered in cold sweat, the faint scent of burnt dust in the air again. The note. One morning, after another restless night, I found a piece of paper on my desk. It was old, yellowed, and torn from a notebook. No handwriting, no markings, just the faint impression of something that had once been written on top of it. I shaded over it with a pencil, and the words slowly appeared. "Don't look at the window." I stared at it for a long time. It wasn't my handwriting. And I kept all my paper in a drawer that I always locked. When I looked up, the corkboard above the desk had the dark circular stain again. The reflection. By mid-semester, I was hardly sleeping. My friends joked about me being the ghost guy. But I stopped inviting anyone to my room after what happened to Josh. He was hanging out one night while we studied. Around 11, he asked if he could crash for a bit, said it was too late to walk back to his dorm. I said sure, and he fell asleep on the floor while I typed up an essay. At some point, he stirred and sat up, looking confused. "What?" I asked. He pointed toward the window. "Who's that?" I turned. There was nothing there, just the reflection of the room, the desk, the lamp. Josh stood up slowly. "I swear I saw someone standing there." He gathered his stuff and left without another word. The next day, he avoided me completely. The whisper returns. Late November. Cold air seeped through the walls. That night, the whispering came back louder this time, more deliberate. I sat up in bed and whispered, "Who are you?" The voice paused. Then, faintly, a single word came through. "Daniel." My chest tightened. I whispered again, "What do you want?" Silence. Then, in that slow, shuddering breath, I heard it right next to my ear. "Don't look." The light bulb above my desk flickered once and went out. The window creaked open on its own, the cold rushing in. I didn't move. Every instinct told me not to turn, not to look. But curiosity, that terrible, human flaw, won. I turned toward the window. The shadow. There was someone standing there. Outside. Pressed against the glass. But that didn't make sense. My room was on the second floor, and there was no ledge, no tree, no balcony. The figure was dark, featureless, like the absence of light itself. I could see the faint outline of a face, hollow, sunken, and where its eyes should have been, the glass seemed to warp inward, like it was being pulled toward the room. I blinked, and it was gone. But when I looked down, the frost on the window had formed two long handprints, palms pressed flat against the glass. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. The door. 2 nights later, it escalated. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of footsteps inside the room. Soft, careful, pacing from the window to the door. Back and forth. I stayed perfectly still, heart pounding so hard I could hear it. Then the doorknob rattled. Slowly. Deliberately. Something was trying to open it from the inside. I jumped out of bed and flicked on the light. Nothing. The door was still locked. But when I checked the inside handle, it was cold to the touch. Freezing cold. And on the corkboard, words had appeared carved faintly into the surface. "He's still here. The winter break." I told the housing office I needed a new room. They said they'd move me after the holidays. So I packed up what I could and stayed with a friend across campus until the semester ended. When I came back after winter break, I stopped by room 209 one last time, just to grab the last of my stuff. The door was already open. Inside, the room was completely bare, no furniture, no corkboard, no smell. Just an empty space filled with pale winter light. I walked to the window and looked out. For a moment, I could see my reflection. And behind it faint, almost transparent, another reflection beside mine. A young man. Still. Watching. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it faded away. Aftermath. I was moved to another dorm the next day. For a while, everything went back to normal. But I still avoid windows at night. Sometimes, in glass doors or dark screens, I'll catch a flicker, a delayed reflection that isn't mine. They say dorm hauntings are just stories students tell to scare each other, exaggerated, imagined, misremembered. But I know better. I lived it. And I'll never forget the last thing written on that corkboard when I left. Don't look at the window. Our final story brings us to Northbridge Hall. A dorm with a single locked door that no one was supposed to open. But late one night, curiosity took over. This is The Locked Door at Northbridge Hall. Story 3, The Locked Door at Northbridge Hall. I used to think college ghost stories were just campus legends, the kind of thing students whispered about during late-night study sessions to scare freshmen. But after what happened to me at Northbridge Hall, I don't laugh at those stories anymore. Because sometimes, the old buildings really do hold on to their ghosts. This is one of those true dorm room ghost stories that never quite leaves you, because part of me still dreams of that locked door, and the sound of something moving behind it when no one was supposed to be there. Moving in. Northbridge Hall was one of the older dorms on campus, all stone and ivy, with wooden floors that creaked under every step. The kind of place that felt historic, not haunted. When I got my room assignment, 107B, the housing email said it was a shared suite. That meant 2 small bedrooms connected by a narrow common area. My roommate, Andrew, was quiet but friendly. He'd been there for a semester already and seemed happy to have company again. When I asked about the other door in the common room, the one that led to 107A, he said casually, "Oh, that one's been locked for years. Maintenance uses it for storage or something." The door was plain, painted white like the rest of the walls, but the lock was heavy old brass with scratches around the keyhole, as if someone had tried to force it open once. I didn't think much of it then. It was just an old door in an old building. The first few nights. For the first week, everything was normal. Classes started, the days blurred together, and I only really noticed the building's quirks, how the pipes moaned when the heat came on, or how footsteps echoed weirdly in the halls even when no one was there. Then, about a week in, I started hearing sounds from the other side of the locked door. At first, it was faint, a soft scraping, like a chair being dragged slowly across the floor. I thought maybe maintenance had someone working late. But when I mentioned it to Andrew the next morning, he just stared at me for a second before saying, "That's impossible. There's no one in there." I laughed it off, but his expression didn't change. He looked almost worried. "The scraping. That night, the sound came again. Long, slow movements. Not constant, just enough to make me pause mid-sentence as I was reading. It always came from behind the locked door, right around midnight. And sometimes, after the scraping stopped, I'd hear what sounded like a sigh. Soft. Human. The next night, I sat on the couch in the common room with my headphones out, listening. At exactly 12:17 a.m., I heard the sound again, scraping, then a faint knock. 3 short taps. I froze. Then, before I could even breathe, another 3 knocks came, louder this time, as if whoever, or whatever, was behind that door wanted me to answer. I whispered, "Hello." Silence. And then, from the other side, one slow knock, deliberate and heavy. That was the moment I realized the sound wasn't random. It was a conversation. The history of room 107A. The next day, I went to the housing office to ask if anyone had used 107A recently. The woman at the desk looked through some files, frowned, and said, "That section hasn't been assigned for years. Room 107A was sealed off after an incident in 2012. I asked what kind of incident. She glanced around and lowered her voice. There was a fire. A student passed away in that room. They never reopened it. A chill ran through me. When I got back to the dorm, Andrew was sitting at the table, headphones around his neck, staring at the locked door. Before I could even say anything, he said quietly, "You heard it again last night, didn't you?" I nodded. He sighed. "You're not the first." The cold spot. Over the next few nights, the air in the common room grew noticeably colder. It wasn't the kind of cold that came from a draft, it was thick, almost electric. If you stood near the locked door too long, you could feel the temperature drop around you, as if the air itself was being pulled away. One night, I put my hand on the doorknob. It was ice cold, even though the rest of the room was warm. Andrew came out of his room just then and said sharply, "Don't touch it." His tone startled me. I'd never heard him sound that serious. When I asked why, he said, "Because when you touch it, it knocks back." I wanted to laugh, but I didn't. There was something in his voice that made me believe him. The knocking escalates. By late October, the knocking had become a nightly ritual. Always the same pattern: 3 slow knocks, a pause, then one louder one. And it always happened when the clock hit 12:17. Some nights I tried to ignore it. Other nights, curiosity got the better of me. Once, I knocked back. 3 short taps. For a moment, there was silence. Then 3 taps in response. Perfectly mimicked. That was the first time I felt real fear. Because that was the moment I knew it wasn't echoes, or pipes, or my imagination. Something intelligent was behind that door. The whisper through the door. One night, I stayed up late, determined to record the sounds. I set my phone on the table, hit record, and waited in the dark. Right on schedule, the knocking began. But this time, there was something else: a faint whispering between the knocks. It wasn't words I could understand at first, more like fragments of breath and sound. Then, gradually, I began to make out a single phrase. "Let me out." I froze completely, eyes fixed on the door. The whisper came again, clearer this time. Please. Let me out. I grabbed my phone, stopped the recording, and replayed it, but all I heard on the audio was static. No knocks. No voice. Just faint white noise. When I looked up again, the doorknob was turning slowly. The locked door moves. The door never opened fully, the lock held. But I could see it shift slightly in its frame, as if something on the other side was pressing against it. I ran into my bedroom and slammed the door shut. In the morning, Andrew knocked softly and asked if I was okay. When I told him what I'd seen, he just nodded slowly and said, "It's worse when you acknowledge it." He told me that before I moved in, he used to hear the same thing every few nights. But after he started ignoring it, the noises stopped until I arrived. Then he said something I'll never forget. "It's not the room that's haunted. It's the door. The note under the door." The following week, I came back from class and found a folded piece of paper on the floor half under the locked door, as if someone had pushed it through from the other side. My hands shook as I picked it up. The paper was yellowed, brittle, and smelled faintly of smoke. There were only 3 words written on it. "Still burning here." The writing was faint but clearly human, shaky, rushed. When I showed it to Andrew, he went pale. He said quietly, "That's her handwriting." When I asked who, he hesitated, then told me the story. The fire. The student who died in 107A was named Lena Hart. She was an art major, quiet, kept to herself. Late one night in 2012, a fire broke out in her room. They said it started from a candle she left near a canvas. By the time help arrived, most of the fire had burned out on its own. But Lena hadn't made it out. What haunted Andrew and later me was that the damage inside the room didn't match the reports. There were burn marks along the inside of the door, as if someone had been pounding on it, trying to get out, but it had stayed locked from the outside. No one ever figured out why. The final night. It happened the night before Thanksgiving break. Andrew had already gone home for the week, and I stayed behind to finish a paper. The dorm was almost empty, silent in a way that made every sound stand out. Around midnight, the air in the room grew heavy again. The cold returned, deeper than before. I wrapped myself in a blanket and tried to focus on my laptop. Then, at 12:17 a.m., the knocking started. 3 taps. Pause. 1 loud one. I whispered, "Lena." The knocking stopped. Then, in a voice so faint I barely heard it, came the words, "Please, help me." The doorknob began to rattle violently, metal clinking against metal. I could hear something hitting the door from the other side, thuds, desperate and frantic. And then the smell of smoke. Thick, choking, unmistakable. I backed away, coughing, but there was no fire, no heat, just the smell, and the sound of someone screaming faintly behind the door. Then, just as suddenly, silence. The smoke smell vanished. The air went still. And when I opened my eyes again, the door was slightly ajar. Inside room 107A. I should have run. But I didn't. I don't know why, maybe curiosity, maybe the hope that she was finally gone. I stepped closer and pushed the door open. It creaked slowly, revealing a dark, empty space. The room inside was blackened, walls scorched, floorboards uneven. And in the center of the floor was a single chair, turned toward the window. On the wall above the chair, someone had written in ash, "Don't lock me in again." My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. As I stood there, a faint warmth brushed past my shoulder, like someone exhaling right beside me. Then, in that same trembling voice, I heard, "Thank you." And the air grew still. Aftermath. When maintenance came the next day, they found the door wide open. They sealed it again within hours, repainting the frame and replacing the lock. I moved out of Northbridge Hall before the next semester began. But sometimes, late at night, I still dream of that door, of the knocking, the smoke, and the voice whispering through the wood. People tell me I just let my imagination get the better of me. But they didn't smell the smoke. They didn't hear the voice. And sometimes, when I'm alone in a quiet room and the clock hits 12:17, I still hear 3 knocks. Dorm rooms are meant to hold memories, laughter, friendship, and the stories of growing up. But some rooms, they hold something else. Echoes of what came before, and whispers that never quite fade. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, it's hard to ignore that uneasy feeling when the hallway lights flicker, and you realize you're not as alone as you thought. Thank you for listening to these true dorm room ghost stories. If you enjoyed tonight's tales, remember to keep your light on just a little longer. And as always, sleep well, if you can.